Hi, I'm Tony. I'm an author, presenter at Sky Sports, and years ago I went to the jungle and got ill. Very ill. So this is my podcast adventure to find more energy. It's packed with biohacking, science, health tech, supplements, and some of the most well-known experts on the planet.
This is something I spent 4 months of my life doing with electrodes glued to my head so that you can do a lifetime worth of meditation.
Decide what you don't give a fuck about, which is something you don't care about.
Some of it gets quite out there.
I had some stem cells sent up to my house that I had stored, and then I injected myself with mannitol.
And we even hack hangovers.
Alcohol is poisonous. So is water and oxygen in the wrong dosage.
So that's my podcast, Zestology. Live life with energy, vitality, and motivation. Hello and welcome to Zestology. This is episode number 300. And to celebrate, I thought I'd go and do one of my favourite things for boosting my energy levels, for re-energising, recharging, revitalising, going to a cryotherapy chamber, London Cryo in central London, to do the podcast intro and outro there. Now, it turns out that when I came back and listened to the recording, it was slightly louder in there than I thought it was, so I've edited it a little bit. So just before you hear me in the cryo tank, I want to say thank you for listening to Zestology for 300 episodes. If you've listened to all 300, I don't know how you did it, but you're still here, so that's great. And I'm thrilled to have Fiona Agombar on Zestology today. Brilliant author, yoga teacher and yoga therapist as well. I suffered from complete burnout a few years ago, spent a few months pretty much unable to do anything. And that's why I do this podcast all about energy. And I wish I'd had Fiona Agombar's advice and book back then when I started the podcast. Genuinely, she's brilliant. And I'm thrilled that she is episode number 300. So before you hear from Fiona, let me dip into London Cryo. So I thought this is episode 300 of my podcast.
Amazing.
Which means I've been doing it about 6 years. And I thought I'd record a podcast intro in a cryotherapy tank at London Cryo with Maria, who owns it alongside me. Hi, Maria.
Amazing.
And my colleague Jasper, who's taking a couple of pictures of me.
I don't know what I got myself in for.
But the reason that I'm recording it is because I feel like I've got a bit more of a wuss about cold recently. I used to be fine about it, but I don't know, I'm feeling it. I'm
You're
really feeling
doing
it now.
fab. You're doing fab, but mind you, it's only minus 107. It's going to get colder. We know it's going to get colder. But
You've got a mask on, so let me just say in case they can hear it. It's minus 107 at the moment, but it's getting colder.
That's right, yes. We're now at minus 114.
How are you feeling, Tony?
I'm feeling all right. If you're listening to this and you fancy it, I highly recommend the safe and capable hands of Maria at London Cryo. That's enough of me literally freezing my nuts off. Let's hear from Fiona Agombar on Zestology, and I'll come back at the end of the podcast. So much of what is in your new book resonates with me and what I kind of want to do with Zestology. And I know at the moment you are specifically dealing with a lot of people who are dealing with fatigue-related issues of various type and more kind of chronic illness as well, sometimes related to COVID. You're getting a real kind of upsurge in that, aren't you?
Sadly, I am. I started my online classes like so many yoga teachers when lockdown happened. And I was really thinking about the ME community because that's the community that I'm experienced with and that I've been working with for a long time. And I just put a few notes on Facebook and on my website that the class is open to everybody with fatigue conditions. And then a couple of people with post-COVID came and joined, and they liked, the way that the class helped them and how yoga was helping them. So they then were putting it on blogs and sharing it. And then more and more people with post-COVID fatigue have come and joined. I've even got people from America and Canada who come to my Wednesday evening class, although for them it's in the afternoon. So, the classes I'm running are open for all fatigue conditions, and it's just very sad that it is the case that is now including people with post-COVID fatigue.
It is, and it actually reminds me very much of what I went through. And I know, being a Zestology friend of the show and a bit of a listener, which I'm very pleased about, you probably know. But obviously, I the reason I do this podcast about energy is because I went through a period when I didn't have any, and that's because I contracted a virus in the jungle. And I went to a neurologist 5 times, as well as all sorts of different specialists. And I have to say, I mean, these neurologists charge an extraordinary amount of money for 15 minutes of your time. And he would just shrug his shoulders and say, look, I'm really sorry, but modern medicine just doesn't know. We just don't know we can't give you an explanation for why. But we do know that post-viral fatigue or syndrome is a thing. You do get a post-viral reaction. That's what I had, and I feel very grateful that it didn't actually last for too long in the bigger scheme of things. And it seems to me that with what's called long COVID now, a lot of people are really, long COVID is another word for post-viral fatigue, isn't it?
I completely agree. It's another word for post-viral fatigue. And in one of the chapters in the book, I try to kind of get to the root of what it is that is causing chronic fatigue, and try to kind of go through the different names and labels. And the nearest I got from the research I did was really that the jury's out really, but it would seem to be that it's to do with the mitochondria being the energy spark of the cell. It's the bit of the cell that produces something called ATP, which is the fuel that gives us energy. And the latest thesis is, and this has been put forward by a professor called Robert Naveau, is that if we are under stress or we are presented with something like a toxin or a virus or extreme pollution, for example, that our mitochondria go into something called shutdown mode. And he calls this the cell danger response. And it's really a protective mechanism. So in order to protect us, our mitochondria close down and they go into what's called defense mode. And instead of energy mode, which they would be in normally. So, and it seems to be that this can be the case across a lot of illnesses. So it could be COVID, it could be glandular fever, it could be Lyme disease, as it has been in my case. But it also could be things like having cancer or Parkinson's that can cause long fatigue. And one of the doctors who I was really impressed with, who I researched, is a doctor called Dr. Terry Walls, who actually has more or less overcome multiple sclerosis through diet and lifestyle. I don't know if you've come across her.
I think I've heard her on Dave Asprey's podcast. Yeah, she's quite well known, isn't she?
She's amazing. And what she says is, don't give your diagnosis, don't label your illness. Don't give it that kind of power. All disease is caused by the shutting down of mitochondria or the cell danger response. So I hope I said it clearly. I think I said it a bit more clearly in the book. But
yeah, you certainly did. And obviously, normally when I'm doing these interviews, I'll do my own research. And one of the great things about this interview is I've had another researcher as well, because my other half, Faith, is absolutely lapping up your book and sent me some fairly detailed notes on WhatsApp about what to ask you last night. So
thank you, Faith.
Yeah, so she said what chronic stress does to the body. Ask her about the role of mitochondria. Ask her about the science. So I'm glad you've kind of gone into that a bit. And I think, with other illnesses, and certainly with histamine intolerance, there's this concept of the histamine bucket. And you'll be absolutely fine until the bucket of histamine gets too high. And if it tips over, then you'll kind of get this cascade of symptoms happening all at once. And I do think there's an element of that with stress as well. I think when you're younger, you can just deal with so much. And even when you get older, you can kind of deal with it until you can't. And then the moment you can't, sometimes it gets quite serious quite quickly.
Well, the science shows that unfortunately with stress, we can become more sensitized via the amygdala, which is in the limbic part of the brain. So that means if you are already stressed, you kind of become sensitized, so that each event that happens, something that might not have stressed you before, you might become more and more sensitized, so you get more and more stressed. So the kind of secret is in how do we switch off that stress response. But, stress is quite complex, which is why I covered it in the first chapter of the book, because I think before we look at fatigue, we do need an understanding of what stress can do to the body. And how we respond to stress is also down to how we are parented, what our childhood is like, whether we've had trauma or not, what our attachment profile is like, how we were parented. So these all kind of have implications to how we respond to stress. And if we are healthy, then we have a healthy stress response. We will need the stress response if there is danger. But so we were going to fight and flight if our organism or the body perceives danger. But in a healthy body or body-mind system, we then switch back into the parasympathetic mode once the stress has passed. And the problem comes if we are chronically stressed. And we might not even be aware that we're chronically stressed, but that is just a mechanism that kind of slowly makes the body more inflamed, more run down, and then we become more susceptible to toxins and viruses. And then this eventually might be why the cell danger response switches the mitochondria off.
Yeah.
So dealing with stress is really important. If we are, struggling with our health or energy, the first thing we need to tackle, we need to look at how we're dealing and managing with stress.
I think stress, you mentioned that some people we don't know when we're stressed. And I think that's very true. And especially this year, one of the themes I was thinking it'd be nice to this podcast is 2020 our most stressful year yet? And for many people, obviously it is for so many reasons. But one of the things is that it's not just stress, is it? It's kind of stimulation. When you're surrounded by news stories and the risk level in your area changes 16 times in 3 months, it's just, we're constantly being stimulated by the worldwide situation and the potential threat and the fear that is applied to ourselves as well. I think that's kind of quite similar to stress, really.
Well, that does cause stress because we're not meant to be kind of on, as it were, all the time. We're meant to have resting periods as well and to let our organism switch off to rest. And I mean, there's a lot being said about this at the moment because it's not just COVID in the news, although that's a huge part of it, but it's also social media, the fact that our phones are constantly giving us updates and notifications and prompting us and stimulating us. And I think those of us who are aware of stress, we are, and I know you've talked about this in previous podcasts, that we actually actively have to make time to switch off. Being whether that's switching our phone into airplane mode or not engaging so much with the news or putting our phone in another room, whatever we can do to give ourselves downtime, we should be doing that because otherwise we're just being constantly hyperstimulated and that is really bad for us. And that does keep us in this kind of chronic stress pattern, which we may not be aware of, although, maybe we're not sleeping so well, or we're maybe even having anxiety attacks, or we're breathing too fast. These are all cues that we might be in the stress response.
Yeah. I mean, that is something that I have to work on so much, Fiona. And I'm going to ask you a question. I want an honest answer here. Are you secretly a bit of a type A personality? Because this book that I've got in my hand is an absolute labour of love. And I know it's taken you many years to write it. And I kind of feel someone who writes this book has had to spend a lot of time on it.
Well, firstly, it's not a secret. I am a type A personality. But, so I'm quite aware of that. But with the book, I started writing it in 2011, I think it was. And it really came, you're right, it was a labour of love. So in that respect, it wasn't something that was stressful to me because I was just doing it more like a hobby and, something that was of interest to me. And then what happened was I was in a relationship with a man called Alan, and I was living in Spain at the time. And then in 2015, Alan got cancer. And he got diagnosed just after I got a commission for the book. So we had to come back to the UK. And basically, I had to put the book to one side because I had to spend all my energy in looking after Alan. And I wrote to the publisher and I said, I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to be able to deliver the book. And I certainly can't meet the deadline. And to my surprise and delight, they wrote back and said, well, we'll give you an open-ended deadline. So that took all pressure off me. And that meant I could really focus on Alan, which I did. But in the last year of his illness, I kind of got this real feeling in my heart that I needed to go back and carry on writing the book again. So I would work for maybe 3 or 4 hours a day on it when I was able to. And by this time, I'd done lots of research, but the research had been, again, very much from a passion of mine, looking at my own health, looking at Alan's health. So it wasn't something that I was doing out of that type A goal-driven need to achieve. It was just something that I really wanted to do. And what the book gave me in that last year was a kind of breathing space away from the stress and difficulty of being a carer. And actually, Alan very sadly died 2 weeks before I handed the manuscript in. So in a way, kind of my journey with him is very much paralleled by my journey with the book. And, his illness informed me and taught me so much. And I hope some of that kind of love and learning has gone into the book. So it never was something that became goal orientated or driven. It was just something that I did from a need to share it, really.
Yeah. And you're very honest in the book as well, aren't you? It's very, very heartfelt at times.
Yes, because I think part of my journey has been about being vulnerable and open, and our need to share that and not to hide. And I think at this juncture, I'd also like to say a big shout out and thank you to my dear friend Leah Barnett, who came in at the end and also contributed and helped, because without her help, I couldn't have finished the book.
Yeah.
And there were lots of other people who helped me, like my teacher, Sarah Ryan, my friend, Clive Shrubsole, who helped me with the references, and my dear friend, Lynn White, who helped with the photography. So, I was really blessed with the kind of people that came and helped me finish it.
Yeah. I'm interrupting this podcast for one moment because I've got something quite important to tell you. The father of modern medicine was Hippocrates, and I actually went to his birthplace recently. I went to Kos in Greece and went to a Hippocrates museum. It was amazing. I loved it. I thought, I've got to go since I'm into all this health stuff. And he said that all disease begins in your gut. And that is why it's so important, especially during these times, to protect yourself with a boosted immune system. If you drink coffee or tea or smoothies or really any beverage in the morning and you're looking for kind of a nice and tasty way to start your day and defend against harmful bacteria, I've got something for you. And if you're someone who likes to experiment a little bit and try new stuff, you will enjoy this. It is the Ultimate Immunity Protection Stack. And it's been put together by my friends at Bioptimizers, who are my podcast partners for today. And I think it's quite clever of them to do this because, let's be honest, the world isn't in a great place at the moment, and we are all thinking about immunity. So it has 3 products. This immunity stack contains over 18 natural herbs and probiotic blends, and it also contains loads of good stuff they call psychobiotics, which help you with your mood, performance, and cognitive function. So you can head to bioptimizers.com/Zestology to find a little bit more about this immunity stack. I'm pleased with it. I think they've done a good job, and I'm really pleased that they're sponsoring this podcast as well. You can use the code Zestology10, okay? Zestology10 to save an extra 10% on the immunity protection stack. If you're in the UK, go to bioptimizers.co.uk. You won't find that deal or stack anywhere else. And this special deal is only until the end of November. So it's a kind of November special, really. Hope you enjoy it. Let me know how you feel. Time to make like Hippocrates and go and get the old immunity stack, okay? The Ultimate Immunity Protection Stack, bioptimizers.com/Zestology. Back to the show. And do you think, in terms of 2020 being such a stressful year and what we were talking about in terms of overstimulation and being type A personalities, is part of what you've learned over the past 8 years and all the horrendous things that you went through with Alan as well, is part of it resilience and kind of compassion for ourselves?
I would actually say that's probably one of the most important lessons that I learned and which has gone into the book, which is self-compassion. And I'd also like to say that Leah, who came in on it, about 10 months before it was delivered, looked through the manuscript. And Leah's not a type A person. She's a type B. She's very laid back. She's brilliant.
Lovely.
But she looked at it and she said, you've not put enough about self-compassion into this. And of course, the reason I hadn't was because it's not something I'm very good at for myself. But she then wrote a beautiful piece on self-compassion. But because she had flagged this up, I then had to kind of go back and do this journey and think, well, you know, she's right. I'm always maybe looking at after other people. I'm still not boundaried enough myself. So it was something I had to revisit for myself, and that, you know, I realised is so important, and something that I now work on with the ME groups and the post-COVID groups that I work with in yoga, because a lot of people with ME or profound fatigue are not good at self-compassion. And I always say, well, if you can't do self-compassion, you can at least do self-acceptance. So we start with self-acceptance, then maybe we move to self-kindness. And from that, we can maybe move on to self-compassion and even maybe self-love if we're lucky. And I don't mean that in a narcissistic kind of way. I just mean appreciating that we count too, and that we can't help other people unless we help ourselves first as well.
Yeah. So people listening to this, how do they do that kind of self-compassion and self-love and looking after ourselves?
Well, the first thing is to be aware of the inner voice and to ask yourself, am I self-compassionate, or am I actually hard on myself? And we find that out really by meditation and times of sitting still and listening in to see whether we have an inner critic. And also to see at times of stress, are we speaking kindly to ourselves about it, or are we putting pressure on ourselves? So awareness is the first thing. Being in meditation is the second. And then the third thing is to start practicing self-acceptance. So if we're having a time of difficulty, a time that's stressful, a time of challenge, just being kind and accepting to ourselves. And also being kind to ourselves about our own conditioning and our own patterns that are running, and maybe seeing that is how we are and that's okay, and just, you know, accepting that this is how we are at this moment. Can I ask you, Tony,
Yeah.
Are you compassionate to yourself? Are you kind to yourself, do you think?
I was just thinking about that when you were talking. I think so, but I mean, look, you know, over the last 7 or 8 years, and certainly when I got ill, perhaps I wasn't so much. I think for me, one of the kind of contributing factors to kind of getting ill and staying ill was just a real kind of churn of anxiety kind of going round and round in my head, worrying about these symptoms. And I think one of the problems, and I've really got a sense of this from your book as well, is sometimes people really start to identify with their illness so much it becomes part of their identity.
Yes.
And it's, you know, when I went to see this guy who's been a guest on my podcast, who is a tapper, so he does emotional freedom therapy, and you might have listened to that one with Ashley Mayer. He's just fantastic, and he really started to help me get better. And in the first 10 minutes of my first session, I was like, I think I'm going to be all right here. And he said to me, you know, people find this so hard to get to grips with when they come in with chronic fatigue and they've been off work for a lot longer than you have. But I have to say to them that part of what is making you ill is what's going on in your head. And that was hard for me to get to grips with.
Well, when we are not separate, mind and body are not separate. And I think in the past, our kind of Western medical model is very much made up of, you know, physical, stroke, mental. So we tend to see physical illnesses as physical, whereas, of course, the mind interplays with all illness. And, you know, the stories we tell ourselves about an illness are bound to have an influence on that. And I mean, I can also give the example because I lived with Alan very closely for 5 years when he had cancer. And that's largely viewed as something which is physical. But of course, his state of mind affected how he was. And that might have been a long time before he actually got the diagnosis. So, you know, absolutely, we cannot separate mind and body. But, you know, what you picked up on is very interesting about how we identify with an illness. Do we see ourselves as the illness? Do we use it to describe us? Because once we go down that road, it's a slippery slope to get back off.
Yeah.
You know, and that's something that's very entrenched within yogic philosophy, what is it we're identifying with, and can we let that go?
I think it's quite, I was actually talking about this with Faith today. There's quite a few influencers that I follow online who suffer from illness, and sometimes it's chronic illness. And their Instagram account is all about their battle with chronic illness. But unfortunately, I think it can be counterproductive, that, because you start to very much identify and get kind of validation for what you're suffering with. Sometimes these people will become famous for their struggles with their illness, and they get a lot of sympathy for it. But it all becomes part of their identity, and their unconscious mind is leading them to staying in that state.
I completely agree with you. And the people I work with, I'm always wary, about, obviously it's up to them, but I think support groups, you've got to be very careful of, because yes, of course, if you're ill and isolated, a support group can be helpful. But then the risk is you take on the identity of that group, and then you can't move on, and you then identify as being a sick person. And then, particularly if you get famous through being sick, there's kind of a reason to not leave that, isn't there? And there's quite a famous healer. I don't know if you've come across Caroline Mace. She wrote a brilliant book called Anatomy of the Spirit, and she uses the word woundology. And what she means by this is that if we resonate with our wounds, and we kind of resonate with other people who've got the same wounds, and that's all we're talking about, we're going to kind of almost vibrate at that frequency. And then it's kind of impossible to move away from that. So I think if we have a chronic illness, these are questions we really need to be asking ourselves. Who are we hanging out with on social media? What are we talking about? Somebody who I really love is Eckhart Tolle. And he says, if you are ill or chronically ill, the only person you should really be discussing your symptoms with is your healthcare provider. And other than that, don't discuss your symptoms, because it's almost like you concretize them. You kind of make it more solid. And when you do that, I think it's a fine line. And certainly when I run retreats, I always suggest that people talk about health and well-being rather than discussing symptoms too much. And I don't mean that unsympathetically. No. It's just a fine line to tread.
That is very, very interesting. I want to think about not just people with chronic health issues, but all of us, and having had a really stressful year and chronically stressful, I might add, for many people. If we're looking at building resilience and compassion, obviously I know meditation is something that you focus on a lot, and yoga as well. There's a lot of breath work in the book as well, which I've really enjoyed. What is something we could do kind of straight away that might take a minute or two that could help us just kind of shift our energies a little bit? And the reason I wanted to ask you this question is because this podcast is about energy, and your book is all about energy. And I love the kind of breathing using the hands that you've got in the book. I know you do some nostril breathing, which I've always really enjoyed. I can't really kind of quite work out why it works, but it does. And what is something that we could do for a minute or two that kind of might take us to a different place?
To breathe more slowly. So when we're stressed, our autonomic nervous system speeds up the breath to get us out of danger, because that's a stress response. So to bring our parasympathetic nervous system back online, we want to breathe more slowly, and preferably through the nose and from the diaphragm. So I would suggest taking the hands and placing them on the navel and slowing the breath right down to maybe 5 or 6 times a minute. And a way to really bring the parasympathetic nervous system online and to calm the whole system down is to slightly lengthen the exhalation. So breath really holds the key. So that's a really powerful way, and a free way, of course, of getting out of the stress response.
I'm doing that now, and I guarantee you everyone listening is right now as well. So that's nice. You probably know from the podcast, I got so into Qigong recently, and I actually did it just before this interview. I did it outside, and the power of the breath is just, that's the bit I know that works the best. It just takes me to a different, I don't think I breathe very deeply normally, but I just do when I do that.
Well, I think, during the pandemic, people have got very anxious and stressed, and we kind of lose connection with the breath. We forget about it. And then we live much more in our heads. And then before we know, we're kind of living in fear and anxiety. And the breath is a way of connecting back in with the body, and just coming back to the present moment. And I mean, you asked, what was a way of getting out of the stress response. Another way is to just come back home into the body and come back into the present moment and just be very mindful of how the body feels. Feel the feet, feel the hands, just feel that the body is a safe place to be.
Absolutely. Well, Fiona, the book is just so good, and I'm very honoured that I'm a little quote of mine is on the back as well, and I feel very honoured because it really is excellent. And I know it hasn't come out yet. We're recording this in October, but we've scheduled it for the week that the book comes out, so it'll be out once people listen to this. What about a book that you would recommend? I believe you're going to be very greedy and have 3 books, not 1.
I know, I'm sorry about that. Because I'm a big fan of yours, so I always know you ask this question. I was thinking, what book can I recommend? Well, the first one's a bit of a cliche, but I love The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. So that's a book which changed my life. Have you read that?
Do you know what? I'm tempted to look at it again now you've recommended it, but I think what I did with Eckhart Tolle is I started listening to the audiobook, and he has an extraordinary voice. So I don't know that I got to the end of it, but I should.
Well, he also wrote another book. This is my 4th book, called A New Earth. So if you don't get The Power of Now, A New Earth is fantastic as well. But the other book I was going to, or 2 books, one book I was going to mention was Lost Connections by Johann Hari.
Oh yes, yeah. I've read quite a few of his books, and I really like him as a writer. He's brilliant.
So that's about the mental health epidemic that we have in the Western world, and he kind of went on a journey to explore why it is that we have so much mental health problems in the West. And he came to many conclusions, but a big one was that we need to set up our social connections again, and that kind of is the key to. And I don't mean online; I mean real social connections, and that is the key to our well-being. And then the 3rd book is a book I've just come across, and it's absolutely brilliant, and it's by somebody called Dr. Elizabeth Stanley. And it's called Widen the Window, and it's about how to deal with stress and trauma. Very, very good book.
Great. Okay. Well, I've made a note of all of those, and I'll maybe give Eckhart Tolle another go, and maybe not listen to the audiobook.
I know some people fall asleep because he's a bit of a monotone when he speaks, but he's brilliant.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then what about one tip for living with more energy and vitality?
It has to be breathing more slowly, being aware of the breath and being more at home in your body and just taking micro breaks during the day, not rushing from one task to the other, but just stopping, coming back home into the body, just being mindful for a bit before you go on to the next thing, not pushing through, not being driven.
Brilliant. Oh, Fiona, it's so good to talk, and I wish you all the very best with the book. Can't wait to see it out and selling on Amazon and doing well.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's a real honour. I'm a huge fan of your podcast.
Oh,
Please
thank you.
say hi to Faith from me.
I will. Yeah,
Thank you so much for having me as a guest. I really appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. And I too am a huge fan of you as well. So I'm really glad we've got to meet and chat. And where can people, just remind people what the book is called, and presumably it'll be on sale everywhere by the time they listen to this.
The book is called Yoga Therapy for Stress, Burnout and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, and it's on my publisher's website, which is Singing Dragon, but it's also on Amazon and other websites like that. It's also on my website, so I don't know if in the show notes you'll be sharing my website, but there are links on there. I've also shared some chanting downloads which go with the book on my website as well.
Oh, great. And your website again is?
It's my name. So it's www.fionaagombar.co.uk.
Good stuff. Look, I have a feeling we'll be speaking again at some point, because my other half, Faith, she's definitely going to get more involved in all of your stuff, and you'll probably meet her on one of your retreats at some point or something like that.
That would be brilliant.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
Great. All right. Well, look, Fiona, thanks very much for coming on Zestology, and good luck with the book.
Thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, that is pretty much it for this podcast. Thank you to Fiona, and I've emerged from the cryo session now. I'm still with my friend and colleague Jasper. Jasper, that was the first time you've done it. How'd you feel?
Do you know what? It was incredible. I'm glad this is only audio because you couldn't see the terrified look on my face before we went in. But it's a really amazing experience. If you can get to do it, it's so worthwhile. I'm a big believer in this kind of cold therapy and going back to be able to control the temperature of your body. And you just end up feeling amazing, don't you? I mean, you come out of it and you can feel your body. I said to you when we came out, like the robe that you put on, it's like no other clothes you put on ever before because you can feel it so much closer to your skin. And this sort of sounds like this sounds like the obvious thing to say, but it really is that good, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm not like. Sometimes I wonder if part of the kind of energizing nature of it is the fact that you're to not put it very politely, you're crapping yourself before you go in there. But it's more than that, isn't it? It does genuinely energize kind of every cell, seemingly.
I think certainly, like physically, it genuinely energizes you, and you can't argue with that. But also getting over that psychological almost burden at the start of knowing that you're going to go into minus 130. Just to put this into context, before I came out, I told my girlfriend about it, and I said, I think you go down to about -3. And I was like thinking, God, that would be cold, wouldn't it? And then we got told, obviously, it was minus 130, and that's just a different world. But it's similar with cold showers. I mean, it's being able to get over that psychological kind of process at the start of it, and that's half the battle, and you get benefits from both, kind of mentally and physically as well, I think. Did you find that?
Yeah, definitely. I feel absolutely brilliant. Obviously, we've had a whole day of it. We've done a float as well with our friends at You Float, and then we'll do another podcast with them soon as well. And a very nice way to celebrate my 300th podcast. So thank you to Fiona Agombar, and thank you, mate, for joining me in this.
It's an absolute honour to be on the number 300.
Number 300, so
long may it continue.
Well, I know you're starting your podcast soon. We'd still love to do a podcast mashup and kind of combine the two.
That would be awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
We'll collab.
Good stuff. And just before I go, thank you to episode 300's podcast partner, and that is the Ultimate Immunity Protection Stack. So grateful to have teamed up with these guys for episode 300 and this month in November as well. The father of modern medicine, Hippocrates, said that all disease begins in your gut, and that is why it's so important at the moment to boost our immunity with things like cryotherapy, if you get the chance, a bit of a float tank if you get the chance, and to look after the more simple things as well. Look at what you eat and look at optimizing your gut with a boosted immune system. It's all about the immune system, especially at the moment. And so the Ultimate Immunity Protection Stack is what you ought to be looking for. If you head to bioptimizers.com/Zestology, you can use the coupon code Zestology10 to save an extra 10% on the Immunity Protection Stack. Really important at this time of year. If you're lucky enough to do a bit of cryo, that's great as well. I hope you find the Ultimate Immunity Protection Stack useful, and you won't find a deal or a stack like that anywhere else. And this special is only available until the end of the month. That's it. What an episode. Spoken to Fiona, done a bit of cryo, done a float, had Jasper on the podcast as well. I look forward to that kind of podcast collaboration with him very soon as well. I definitely must do that. And I can't believe I got to episode 300. So thanks for listening. See you next time.